Changing landscape, changing climate, changing attitudes, the evolution of emergency volunteering. And this conversation is so important because it is about the different ways that volunteers are involved in preparing for, responding to, and being there after emergencies. I forgot to mention, we don't have a formal break between these two sessions. So while our next panelists get mic'd up, if anyone would like to stretch their legs, take a bathroom break, or go into the quiet room, you're very welcome to do that now. But otherwise, we do beg your attention for our next panel before we release you to afternoon tea. The panelists today cover a broad range of aspects of volunteering, and they'll be talking to us about their experience in involving volunteers in all different aspects of emergency preparedness, response and recovery. And this conversation is so important because after subsequent crises and off the back of a global pandemic, emergency volunteering and the role of volunteers in crises will be more and more important as we move forward into the future. So please, everyone who is stretching their legs, come and join us. And I now invite Mark O'Reilly from the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, John Richardson from the Australian Institute of Disaster Resilience to join us on stage and introduce our panellists. Sorry, John. I had the wrong name in my notes and I got very confused. Are we ready to go?
Yeah, so a couple of technical challenges just out the back there, things like miking up. But while we wait, what I'm going to ask you to do so this is a session about disaster resilience, and and so we're all disaster managers. Yes, we are. And so what I want you to have a think about is the disasters that you've been involved in. And so think about sort of, what happened and what went well and what didn't go well. If you haven't been involved in a disaster, have a think about how you might prepare for one and what the kind of one thing that you would do. And then while the so have a think about that, maybe write this down. If you get a chance, have a chat to your neighbour. Just to talk about your experience if you can't do that here. As Sarah said earlier, feel free to talk about that in the breaks. Looks like we've got a panel which is fantastic, so let's get underway because I know that it's a little bit behind time. So as I said, my name's John Richardson. I'm the manager for knowledge development at the Australian Institute for Disaster Resilience, which is the National Institute for Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience. If we kind of do our job well, then we don't have to worry about any of this disaster stuff. Unfortunately, the challenge is a bit bigger than that. Also, just want to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal people who are traditional custodians of the lands on which we're all, gathered here to unpack these important issues. Pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and of course any First Nations people who are in the room. I think it's often important to reflect that the Ngunnawal people and our First Nations people have been living with fire, flood, cyclones, volcanic activity and earthquakes and other what we call hazards for 60,000 years. So there's certainly a lot that we can learn from as in terms of how to live with sort of hazards and disasters. I'm reminded in this amazing hall a great sort of band from Canberra in the 1990s, the Falling Joys, and one of their great songs is the You're in a Mess This Time. And I think about that, when I was thinking about that, I was thinking about the mess that sort of disasters impact on sort of people's lives. And it's not like this kind of simple sort of, sort of minor disruption to people's lives. These impacts are sort of felt for months into years and sometimes into decades. Certainly I've been involved in research at the University of Melbourne, and so 10 years after Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria, still like a fifth of the population are experiencing serious mental health issues, and we all know what disruption that makes to sort of people's lives. So disaster impacts are certainly serious, and interesting, the conference presentation, the theme is around the future is now, and as part of me that sort of thinks, as having been doing this for sort of 25 years or more, yes, it is. So if we think that, about the climate and how it is changing and what we've been experiencing with the increasing disasters compounding and cascading, we have conflicts in Europe again, which many of us thought that we probably would never see. We have, the challenges of sort of cost of living and the like. So these are all pressures that contribute to people's lives and decisions that they make around how they can try and keep themselves safe and kind of try and live the sort of prosperous and good lives that, the United Nations Sustainable Development Agenda says. This is what we're here for. This is kind of what it's all about. Good thing is, I think, I'm an optimistic realist, and I think this is what this session is about. As I said, I've been doing this sort of work for 25 years, or it's actually a bit longer, because just up the road, a 20-year-old sort of version of myself was in a geography class called Environmental Hazards in, I think, about 1984, and that kind of sparked my interest in all of this. So, but when we started, it was a very small cohort of people. So it was the fire, SES, police, Salvation Army, Red Cross, local government, all around the table. And it was a fairly simple approach to things. We kind of probably did more to people rather than with people. And, the community was not even really there. So that obviously has changed, massive change in the way we go about things. We, understand and recognise that, the community has capacity, self-organise every day of the week, as we heard. That's what you all do. You self-organise, you help people self-organise, and this is the community capacity, the connections, the social capital that we now know and understand is a fundamental bedrock of disaster risk reduction and sort of resilience building. And so that's now being reflected in policy and with a national risk reduction framework and other policy documents. But the other part of this is how this is reflected is this panel, and where our panel, we do have sort of representatives of what we would call emergent or non-traditional type volunteering. And so this is a great opportunity. So no uniforms up on stage here. There is going to be another session with traditional volunteering, emergency volunteering, but this, this is where we're actually kind of responding to some of the challenges that have emerged over the last 3 or so years, and we're bringing together, I guess, the real capacity that sort of lies, within us all. So I'm going to stop there, because I can talk, and people in this audience know I can talk about this stuff forever and ever, but I've been told we have to finish by 5:30. So, and you don't want to hear from me all, because we've got the panel to be talking. So I'm going to ask our panel, Liz, Mark and Brad, to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the juicy stuff. So, Liz.
Fabulous. Hi everyone, my name is Liz Mackinlay. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Australian Business Volunteers. Those of you that know ABV, Australian Business Volunteers, we've been around for over 40 years, but up until about 4 years ago, we were doing international volunteering and we were focused on strengthening communities through business. So what we do really, really well is we bring skilled business people who donate their time, and we worked across Asia Pacific trying to strengthen small, medium enterprises. But as I watched Black Summer unfold, and I live in Sydney, but I was in Yass with an aunt, I was really perturbed by the lack of application of international disaster recovery principles here at home. I've worked in international development and disaster recovery for nearly 30 years. I've worked all around the world, the Haiti earthquake, floods in Cambodia. I know those frameworks, and I was sitting in Yass watching Black Summer unfold. And remember, with Black Summer, it came down from Queensland through New South Wales into Victoria. We saw it coming. The communities were waiting for it to come. So through a personal connection, I said to a friend of my aunt's, and particularly Cobargo was in the news, and they just had the visit from the then Prime Minister that hadn't gone well. And I had said, look, in about 6 to 9 months, Cobargo is going to be knackered. They are really going to need some help. And this is where an organisation like ABV, who is a non-traditional responder in recovery and resilience, we could come alongside them and help them with the vision of recovery. We don't have to tell them what to do. They know what they want to do, but they're going to be really exhausted. And not only can we come alongside, but we could bring a bunch of corporate volunteers. And we were able to convince our corporate partners to do that. And so when we talk about the non-traditional actors, this is what ABV's been really privileged to do the last 3 years. And we've expanded our work across southern New South Wales into Victoria. Further expansion is happening because, as John says, community knows what it wants to do. The problem is they're impacted by the disaster personally. They may have lost houses. Their friends and family have definitely lost houses. They know the vision for rebuilding that they would like to do, but they're exhausted. They're volunteers themselves, and they also cannot manage a cohort of well-meaning volunteers descending on them. They don't have the accommodation, the infrastructure to look after them. So intermediaries like ABV, and there's a number of agencies like us, I think are critical in this new environment of complex, frequent, simultaneous, ever-happening disasters. So that's one of the reasons that ABV is delighted to be on this panel today, so that we can actually talk with you about some of the things we learn. The number one principle is that community-led has to mean the community is making the decisions. We talk about community-led, and many of our community leaders say to us, we're sick and tired of people coming and standing on the edge of community saying, look, we're here to help, but you get on and do it. And the community says, well, look, we don't have any resources to make that decision. How do you support us to make those decisions? And that, I think, is the conundrum that we as a volunteering community and a volunteering sector need to really engage with. How do we bring non-traditional actors together to come alongside, walk alongside community so that they can own their own preparedness, recovery and resilience?
Thanks, Liz. And note that, you know, in the National Strategy for Volunteering, community-led is like a key priority, and it's such a key part, key platform for disaster risk reduction and recovery. Mark.
Thank you very much. So I'm probably a bit of an imposter as a volunteer because I've been a professional firefighter and a professional soldier all my life, and it's only since I retired recently that I've been active as a full-time volunteer. So why I was motivated to join Disaster Relief Australia, some of the guys I was in the military with, CEO, I used to be in the same unit as Jeff, and when he set it up, he reached out to people from the unit, and we bonded together. So I've been there since 2016 when the organisation was known as Team Rubicon Australia, and when we started then. And then, funnily enough, following on from Liz, during the 1920 bushfires, I was the deployment commander for Fire and Rescue New South Wales out of Orchard Hills. And I worked there continuously from, I think it was August 27th till February the 15th or 16th, and deploying people going backwards and forwards to the bushfires. People from the Melbourne Fire Brigade came up, Adelaide came across, Queensland came down. We would make sure their trucks were ready to go, and then they would go out, and then we would have the volunteers come in from the Rural Fire Service of New South Wales, you know, the CFA from Victoria and so on. There was always this sort of angst between the two groups, as though there were two different groups of people. They were all, to me, they were all on exactly the same truck, and they were all doing exactly the same job to an extremely high standard. So that got me thinking that, like, you know, one day the Commissioner of Fire and Rescue, who had retired, Greg Mullins, I deployed him 3 or 4 times. Tony Abbott turned up, the ex-Prime Minister of Australia, deployed him half a dozen times. You know, so it was a real eye-opener to see what the permanent, or the career firefighters, I'll call them, were saying, and then what the volunteer firefighters were saying. Roll forward a little bit. I got 2 weeks off because I'd worked for a considerable period of time, and Disaster Relief Australia phoned up and says, we need to establish an operation in Cobargo. Cobargo has been devastated by the bushfires. I knew that because I had sent fire trucks down there, both volunteer and career firefighters down there to deal with the fires after New Year's Eve. I think it was New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. And I said, okay, I'll take that on. So I went down to Cobargo. We always have a tradition of naming our operations after a famous local. And we chose Op Ryan. Op Ryan was a VC winner from the First World War, and Op Ryan began. So I set it up. I was the first mission commander, had it running, and it ran until COVID hit. It was about 9 or 10 weeks, I can't remember, and we had to close it down because of COVID, because of the intimacy in which we sleep. We all sleep on the floor in a sleeping bag on a blow-up air mattress at that stage. So we had to close Cobargo down, and we left. It was tragic because you could see the pain in the local community of Cobargo's eyes, because we had been there for a considerable period of time serving them. So it gives me great pleasure to tell you today, I drove back from Cobargo yesterday. We have reinstigated Operation Solway. It's back in the town. We're running for, we're lucky enough to get a government grant for 10 weeks. Well, we didn't get the grant, but we applied for the grant on behalf of Bega Valley, and we're from the Commonwealth, and then we're there for the next 10 weeks, and it's a heartfelt, right? I walked into the town about 3 or 4 weeks ago to do what we call a operational reconnaissance team, just going to touch base with council and the stakeholders in community, and some of them remembered me. So I was a bit grey and a bit older and maybe a bit paunchier, but they remembered me, and we had a great time. And like it's just to see the morale in the town lift is enormous. And so we've got as well as doing some chainsaw work, clearing tracks and roads. That's because all the younger people seem to have moved away. We were talking about the demographics of volunteering. All the younger people seem to have moved away, but the older residents have stayed, and they're the ones who need our help the most. So we're back down there helping them. So we're down there, Liz. And we hope to get a bit of work with some collaboration between Disaster Relief Australia and Australian Business Volunteers. So that's basically my story. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark. Thank you. And Brad, the man from the government.
Thank you. So in the interest of diversity, I'm a career public servant. So my name is Brad Creevey. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. It was fantastic to be able to see the launch of the strategy. I know there's a huge amount of work's gone into that, and I think it's going to make an amazing difference in the way we look at volunteering. And there's a lot of work going on right now, right across the country, to look at the future. So I'm very pleased to be here. Just picking up a bit of background theme. So as I said, I've spent over 23 years in public service, range of roles. For the last 10 years, I've been in IT, building enterprise capability, data first, reusable technology, and now I'm working in NEMA directly. So I've been in NEMA, well, in EMA previously, but NEMA for about 18 months as a senior leader. I'm part of the leadership team that's been involved in the establishment of the new agency. And we're looking at everything that we do, and we're looking at how we move all of that into the future. The reason I joined NEMA is I wanted to make a difference. As I said, I've been in public service for over 2 decades. I've got about another 8 or 10 years left to me, and I thought, you know what? I think I'll join NEMA. It's been an amazing experience for me. As I said, coming from pure public service and IT background, over the last 6 months, I've got to support my operational colleagues part of the emergency management and response group. And as an example, up until Thursday last week, for a period of a week and a half, I was the National Commonwealth Crisis Coordinator for a number of comm display and activations across the country, including Fitzroy Crossing in the Northern Territory, WA and Northern Territory, and residual work in South Australia and Victoria, which for me was a fantastic opportunity, and I got to see the work that's been done across the country. And while I've got the opportunity, I do want to take this chance to just recognise the amazing contribution of volunteers in the limited time even that I've been there, right across the country. So thank you all, to you and your organisations.
Thanks, Brad. Okay, so we might get on to some questions and we'll unpack some of these. We've already started, clearly, which has been fantastic. And Liz, I think you kind of got the ball rolling when we sort of talked about the 1920 bushfires, and then for many communities across the country, it's the bushfires, and then we had COVID, and then we had floods, and then we had floods again, and more floods, and this is in the background of drought. So, so communities are under a lot of stress, and this can obviously test the resilience and capacity of them. What I suppose I'm interested in hearing, perhaps from Liz and Mark initially, is so how in doing this work in communities a lot of stress. How do we actually kind of care for the carers? Like, you know, thinking about the mental health impacts on the people who are actually doing the work. So interested, probably both of you, and then Brad, if there's something that you contribute some from a policy sense or not, you know, broader strategy sense, that would be fabulous.
Sure. I think it's an incredibly important question. When we first went to Cobargo in early September 2020, what struck me, there were two things that struck me. One was the diversity and creativity of ideas for recovery and building back better. That just blew us away. The other thing that really struck us was the universal sense of deep trauma that everybody was carrying. Whether they'd lost a house, whether their friend had lost a house, they had all gone through the catastrophe together. So one of the things that we built into the model that we roll out now is trauma-informed engagement. So none of my staff, none of my volunteers go to a community or engage with a community unless they've done trauma-informed training. Now, we're not counsellors. Anglicare and a whole range of other organisations are fabulous in that space, but the work we're doing necessarily uncovers the trauma that people are experiencing. So my encouragement for anybody working in this space is what we've done. We sourced a bespoke trauma-informed training program for our staff and our volunteers, and nobody goes without that. And as I think someone said in the previous session, EAP is available for any of our workforce. And I look at our workforce as staff and volunteers. There's no distinction for me. I also think the multi-layered nature, John, as you were saying, for some of the communities, they say we had 7 years of drought, which was devastating for us. And then we had the fires, and then we had COVID, which meant we couldn't collaborate and work together. And then the floods came. So they're looking at 12, 15 years of trauma. So it is a serious issue in our emergency response and recovery, and I encourage that to always be a lens that we look at it.
Right, thanks. Mark.
So the statistics for Disaster Relief Australia is about 72 or 73% veterans, and then about 13 to 15% first responders, police officers, paramedics and so forth, and a percentage of generally relatives of either police, fire, ambulance or Army, Navy, Air Force. So we have a high exposure to post-traumatic stress before they even join the organisation as a volunteer. And so the thing that sold me was that I suffered a small bout of post-traumatic stress just before the 2019 fires. And funnily enough, I found that working hard in a recovery mode when I was managing the deployment centre, I came out the other end and as though nothing had ever happened. So I am a firm believer that post-traumatic stress is a period in your life that you become powered by bad things, and when you do good things, it goes away. The issue we have with veterans and police and fire and paramedics coming in, and doctors and nurses, we have a considerable number of doctors and nurses, is that they probably bring their symptoms or the beginnings or the ends of post-traumatic stress when they come to our organisation. And I always have a chat to them because I can see them. I have the 1,000-yard stare. Doesn't matter what service they were in, and we'll have a chat. And I encourage my firefighter friends who are still serving to come along, and we have a large number of veterans in the fire service because they're drawn to that action sort of orientated engagement, and they come to Disaster Relief Australia and they work in communities like Tobago, and you see that you're not so bad off. As bad as you think you are, you're not as bad off, and it helps you recover and it puts you in a more positive mind frame. So Disaster Relief Australia has, we have this feel good about, post-traumatic stress, but we don't have any data. And I'm sure the NEM will be happy to know we're collecting data, but we're collecting data and it's showing us that we're actually people become better. Their symptoms from post-traumatic stress decrease and it becomes more manageable after they deploy on recovery operations. And so we have people now that come. We have a rule, you're going to do 7 days in an area of operations because it is quite stressful. The hard work is excellent because physical labour is really good to deal with post-traumatic stress. But the trauma of meeting people whose houses have burnt down, they've lost all their cattle and their fences. The house at the moment, we're doing a lot of floods and the flood work is it's really hard. Like the fire work is hard. But, you're cutting trees, repairing fences and stuff, it's not that bad. But when you're going through houses that have got mould and fungus and they're starting to deteriorate and they're rotting, it is really an awful workplace. Funnily enough, the veterans and the first responders that we send into those places, they take the work and they grab hold of it with both hands and gives them some hard labour and they feel better. Because at the end of it, instead of going to a fire or going to a war and there's no real end, at the end of it, they've got a clean house. At the end of it, they've cleared a fence line. At the end of it, they've done cross-cutting of trees and the driveway is clear so the farmer can get their cattle in and out, something they probably couldn't do before. So, yes, so for us, we've developed a process. We have at least one wellbeing person on every wave that we run. We're getting a greater than 50% average of people who've done mental health and wellbeing training. We have a number of peer support people who, they make a regular telephone call at the end of an operation to make sure you're okay. And just recently, since the middle of last year, we've actually started conducting polling to see, how you're feeling today. Tick, good, tick, across, bad, or whatever it may be. So it's on the telephone app. You get a telephone call, get a prompt, you fill out your form, and it tells you how your well-being is. So now we have statistical data. We have metadata to say, serving with Disaster Relief Australia as a volunteer is really good for your mental health and well-being. So rather than the feel-good thing, we actually have data to back it up.
That's good.
Yep.
Thanks, Mark. Brad.
I think just to pick up what you were saying, Mark, obviously where there are government funded programs, what we're looking to do is to build that research base and information and data collection, because the more we build that up, the much easier it is for us to target, to prioritise, to get the right money in the right areas. In addition to that, obviously many of you here would be aware that over the last year or so, former NRRA agency, now part of NEMA, has been working on the National Mental Health Plan for Emergency Service Workers. That's been in play for some time. That's now in process of being finalised for endorsement by state and territory governments. That's going to be quite a significant driver around how we approach. It is focused on emergency service workers. However, those principles and a lot of the research and engagement that happen on the back of that will be factored into other programs. But as I said, research, data, and making well prioritised decisions around funding and support through the different programs that we have.
Great. As a manager of knowledge development, music to my ears to hear this. This is great. I guess one of the things that out of the national strategy for volunteering is the importance of sort of diversity and inclusiveness. So I'm interested in both of your views on how your organisations seek to, I guess, try and represent or look like the communities that you're looking to serve and be inclusive.
Sure. I think one of the important things, the way that ABV goes into disaster affected communities, is we don't bring a program in. I don't have a government funded program that says I have to deliver X number of activities. Through our partnerships with corporate and through generous funding from certain government agencies, we're able to walk in and meet the community where they are. And so I think that's been a shift that I've seen in sort of this 10 years, having seen the response in Victoria after Black Saturday, and then looking at what's happening post Black Summer in New South Wales, Victoria. Everybody realises you cannot just rely on the traditional services. They're super important. Fire, police, the Rural Fire Service, parks, they're very important services. But actually it's community members themselves that found they needed to mobilise and be part of their own solution. And so that's not your traditional guy on the hose, because it is predominantly the guy on the hose. It's actually, the CWA, it's the Scouts, it's the local neighbourhood centre, it's the showground. In the example of Cobargo, it's the folk festival. So if you go in and in a posture of listening and just actually meeting the community and saying, introduce us to the next group. Who are the other people working in recovery and response? And then you get the local cricket team or the men's shed in Batlow saying, well, actually, we've got part of the solution for not only the recovery, but also what does our preparedness plan look like? I think that's how you get the diversity of voices in. I will give a shout out to Bronnie McIntosh, Girls on Fire. I don't know if Bronnie's here today. Bronnie has an amazing program where she's trying to work to allow girls and young women to see themselves as first responders. She runs fire camps and she has diversity and pride and First Nations. More initiatives like that are really critical. I think helping our first responders be representative of their communities, because then they're going to know what will resonate, but then working with the social capital that already exists in these towns. One of the examples we had was a community were evacuated to the showground. Many communities were evacuated because it's probably the sort of most treeless area in the Black Summer. And then a few first responders came in and said, we are forcing you to leave. And the community just said, no, we're not going. We're not going. We collectively are prepared to stand and fight. Forcing a community to abandon the social capital that says we're prepared to be here, and I'm not saying be stupid, I'm not saying, if you've been told to leave and you're not, that's actually part of allowing the diversity of voices to inform recovery and resilience. So I think we need to start with the social capital that already exists in community and work from there.
Yep, right, thanks.
So before I forget, Bronnie and I used to work together. And I fully support her program. Her logic is, if you can't see it, you can't be it.
Yeah.
And so, like before, one of the jobs before I retired was I was the headmaster of the training academy at Orchard Hills, and Bronnie would come out there and run little half-day vignettes, and that has increased the female applicants to join Fire and Rescue New South Wales, as well as the Rural Fire Service and State Emergency Services, because they feel empowered that they can do that job, and that's critical. They look at it and go, "Oh, yeah, I don't think you can do that." My eldest daughter, I don't want to keep going down the family track, but my eldest daughter had a girlfriend who wanted to join the fire brigade. I put her in touch with Bronnie. She did one of Bronnie's things. She's now joining. She's in the next recruit class, I think, in about a month or two's time. So it does work. So if you can't see it, you can't be it. So that's the inclusiveness. Disaster Relief Australia, we're based on military and, like I said, emergency first responders. So we actually reflect almost identically the diversity statistics of the Army, Navy, Air Force, Police, Fire, Ambulance. So having said that, I have noticed over the last 6 years or so that it's changing, because as the inclusiveness and diversity in the different services is balancing out, and it's still got a huge distance to go. Like, I'm not reviling from that statistic, but as you know, the numbers are coming closer together, we're seeing exactly the same thing in Disaster Relief Australia. We're getting more female paramedics. We're getting more diverse, firefighters and Indigenous firefighters, and we're getting large numbers of military veterans in the same way coming over who are in the diversity groups. So yeah, that's a good thing. And again, if you see Bronnie's Girls on Fire, please support your people to go to it. It's open. I'm pretty 99% certain it's free to people, but it's well worth the effort to get there. And she needs the support to get around Australia, because it is getting traction with our younger females. So yeah. and Indigenous and so forth. So.
Right. Thanks, Brad.
So I'll bookend that a little bit. From our perspective, if you look at it from a government position, really it's about well-informed policies and well-designed programs, and they're pretty boring topics, but really having that well-designed and well-researched information at government level makes a huge difference when we go to implementing things across the country. So for us, it's about listening, and listening in different ways. We haven't always been that great at listening in the Commonwealth Government, but particularly in NEMA, we've, as a new agency, and we've only been around since the 1st of September in our current guise, under our new leadership and with the direction that we have, listening in a number of different ways is really critical to what we do. So a couple of key examples of that. From the emergency management and response side of the house, really I'd highlight the work of my colleagues in the National Coordination Mechanism. This really came out of COVID. It was born during the COVID-19 crisis as a way that the government could get together and we could have targeted, well thought out approaches to problem solving in short timeframes. So this is built into a branch of its own right within my organisation, led by one of my colleagues, Craig Bickel, and the NCM has developed a really effective mechanism where we bring all the people that are needed to make a decision to inform and to act as a convening body. So not with any kind of particular direction, but to convene and get the right answer to the problem that we've got. So part of that is our high-risk weather season briefings. You might have noticed this year that the range and scope of that has increased. That's an ongoing program. This year, we had specific disability sector briefings and not-for-profit organisation briefings, and they will continue. In addition to that, as I mentioned, we've got research. We partnered with the Centre for Disability Research and Policy around a disability inclusive disaster risk reduction approach. So as I said, it's research, being informed through that to inform your policies, but also engagement and opening that engagement up to industry, to not-for-profit organisations and to the community more broadly.
Great. Thanks, Brad. We've probably got time for one more question, then it's over to you folks. And I don't want to stop you from that. So I'm going to change it up a little bit now. So we've been talking about stuff that happens after the disaster and the extraordinary sort of work that gets done. But I want you to turn your minds to pre-disaster. How can we reduce the impacts of these disasters from happening? And what role do you think your organisations can play or are playing or can play in this, or what must we do? And what role do you think all of our organisations out here could be playing in that risk reduction, resilience building, pre-disaster? So disaster sort of a bump in the road rather than a car crash is sort of where you want to go. So
it's up to you.
You want?
So
You
I'll take the lead, take a bit of pressure off this.
She's gone first.
So Disaster Relief Australia, we also, like, as well as recovery, we practice resilience. And resilience, if we do the right work in resilience, it reduces the impact of a disaster on a community. And how we do that, we have two avenues to do that. We do what we call service projects, where we look at a community and work out what they need to make them more resilient. You know, other emergency service facilities, you know, tree free, so that a tree doesn't fall down in front of the RFS hut or the CFA hut, so they can respond. Likewise, an ambulance station and so forth. So when we identify these facilities, and we have a number of partners, Minderoo is one of our great partners, and we'll do two things. We'll do a bit of we call it a big map. In the military, it's called the Joint Military Appreciation Process, a JMAP, and when I was a captain in the infantry, that's how I learned to do that. And we've just modified that into doing a big map for, it might be floods, it might be bushfires, it could be earthquake, it could whatever the risks for that community are. And then when we've held that, we talk to the community and say, what do you need to make your community more resilient? And we listen to the community, because sometimes they've got 80 years of history in that. So we go to Cobargo, for example, and I was walking around the cemetery about 4 weeks ago when we were looking, you know, at the headstones, and they go back nearly 180 years, I think it is. And like when I was talking to the lady who was running the recovery operation that we were dealing with, and I won't mention her name, but she was related to nearly everybody in the town, because they'd moved out and come in and moved around. It wasn't an inbred town, I'll just make that pretty clear. But it was a town that people had come in and they had gained a name and so forth. And it was really heartening to see the lifeblood in that community. And by talking to them, we're now mounting a couple of resilience projects in Cobargo that will support the Rural Fire Service crew, because they are at risk from a couple of trees that could fall down, and one of them will damage or destroy the RFS shed. The other one will stop them responding. So if we trim and cut back, so it's not an issue, then that we've built the resilience of that. So, and then going back to Minderoo nationally ran a huge volunteering day for for corporate volunteers, and Disaster Relief Australia supported them because the numbers were so immense they couldn't manage them themselves with their small smart staff, so we expanded on their staff and assisted them. And that's really heartening, because we find that, you know, those corporate volunteers actually get it, and then they get engaged in their own local communities, and then there's all the well-being that goes with that. They have a sense of, you know, accomplishment. They have a sense of pride in that they've done something, and then they have a sense of team, because, you know, some of the teams that came away were a little bit catty in the morning when we got them, but by the end of the day they were very competitive, and they were really hard workers, and they did a great effort in the projects I assisted with. So yeah.
Well, thanks, Mark.
Yeah, look, let me just add, one of the things that we need to be careful about when we look at preparedness is what's the involvement of the local businesses. Because if you lose your local businesses post-disaster, then that's your community sustainability gone. And all the research is telling us, and we have a wonderful relationship with Deakin and the Centre for Humanitarian Leadership. The research is telling us that the business owners, and often the business owners don't own the buildings they're in, they're renting them, are the least engaged in the preparedness for disasters. Now, if you think about the logic of that, that's really catastrophic, because the disaster comes through and organisations like DRA, the RFS, the local council, everyone's now getting ready for the physical infrastructure. But if we don't get the businesses involved prior to any event, then we're really absolutely hamstringing the future of those communities. So that's something that ABV is sort of pivoting around this last 6 months and will be focused on, is ensuring that the local business community understands what their place in preparedness and resilience is, so that the whole community can be engaged in that.
Fantastic, that's great. Brad?
So I suppose I'd probably highlight three things. We did talk about the high-risk weather season preparedness briefings. It's one of our national vehicles, and making that more inclusive, reaching into different parts of the community, looking at business as well as industry and community impacts. I'd also highlight some of the work that we're planning to do, particularly relevant to this forum. So at the National Emergency Management Ministers meeting, and that's a mouthful if you've ever had to type that, NEM, meeting in December last year, it was decided that NEMA, as is now, would, through our national coordination mechanism, be the convening body for a national protocol on volunteering and not-for-profit NGO operational collaboration. That's going to be really critical when we're looking at preparedness for nationally significant disasters. It doesn't change the way that things operate in states and territories for their existing model, but when we're talking about a nationally significant event, this will be a new body of work, and my agency is going to be leading that through the National Coordination Mechanism, and the NCM will have an ongoing role working with states and territory governments. So it is firmly aimed at preparedness, notwithstanding the layered impacts on communities and that involvement, but from an organisational government cooperation and collaboration, it's going to be very important going forward. The last thing I'd say, which I think you'd all expect, is the Disaster Ready Fund. So if you'll all be aware of the government's commitment for $200 million a year for Disaster Ready Fund, that's in play now. We're talking currently working through round one, which will be from 1 July 2023. So those applications are open to state and territory governments, and organisations can work with state and territory governments to make applications or support applications for that funding. But that fund is specifically aimed at improving our readiness nationally going forward.
Great. Thanks, Brad. We might draw this part of it to close and open the floor to some questions. We've got, I think, a couple of roving mics, and I'm sure Sarah she was going to look at the Slido questions. But do we have any questions from the floor? Let's see. Over there, right up the top there, and one down the front here. Who's going to get there first? Yep.
Hi, I might have got a loud voice. Hi, I'm Ricky Spencer. I'm a community health sociologist. I'm also co-chair of Rainbow Voices, People Living with Disabilities in Victoria, a new space that's being launched shortly, as well as being on the advisory space with Volunteer Victoria. One of my passions and interests, in community preparedness is something you mentioned. I was very happy you used that language about people living with disabilities, especially when it comes to recovery preparedness. I'd worked closely with a few First Nations communities when the recent floods, and a lot of the information they didn't receive because they were basically regional areas, and one presumed that one was telling information to the group, and it wasn't. One of my aims or hopes in life eventually, that with all these digital communications we have, as leaders in the community, are you working with local communities to perhaps reshape community educational preparedness on the local level, especially for people with disabilities, people in aged spaces like myself who are mobility limited, in private rental or government rental, when something happens, that they're going to be looked after or supported. I'm really concerned that as a society we've moved away from care, and when I've come today, it's lovely that we're all bringing back care. Sorry, I've been a bit nostalgic, but I'm just wondering, do you see that we have to work at plans working at that level, especially in remote and regional spaces? Thank you.
Great question. So
I'll be quick. Yes, I think if I could hear the question properly, is the planning for preparedness including looking after people with disabilities and making sure they're part of the response? And I think an enormous amount was learnt out of Lismore, particularly because the flood in many ways was felt as unexpected. So I think, Mark, you might have some examples from DRA, but disability inclusiveness is critical, and I think it's not just disability inclusiveness, there are other vulnerabilities in the community, and so all of our planning, and this is why you can't outsource your planning to the agencies. The planning has to be grounded in the social capital of the community so that everybody that needs to be looked after and part of the response is part of it.
So in the last 12 months, I've worked on floods in Queensland, New South Wales and currently Victoria, and we've got operations in Victoria and New South Wales at the moment. So I've seen the worst of practice and I've seen the best of practice. So I'll focus on what I regard as industry best practice for Australia, and that's currently in Victoria. So Emergency Management Victoria had stood up their whole state coordination centre. I was directed to be their Disaster Relief Australia liaison officer, and I was included in every brief 4 times a day, 7 days a week, and they worked really, really well. And then we went to a point where the disaster it's still a disaster, still flowing down the Murray River, right? So there's still water that flowed down from the western side of the New South Wales Great Dividing Range and it's going out to Adelaide, and the water is building up in Adelaide as I speak. So a really well coordinated approach. They still had a disaster in function, but as it became possible to conduct recovery operations, the Emergency Recovery Victoria, which used to be the Bushfire Recovery Organisation, they've morphed into an emergency recovery because they've realised they're not going to get a bushfire at the moment, they've got a massive flood. And they did a handover, which I was present, and it was as smooth as silk because they had spent a week in the State Coordination Centre picking up all the bits and pieces that they need. And then when it came time to hand over, Commissioner Crisp gave a great briefing, and then the guys and girls from Emergency Recovery Victoria, mainly Christian George, who I know from the military, and Christian has been directing. He's the director running that section, and it was a really smooth handover. Like previously in Queensland, it wasn't too bad. In southeast Queensland, when the big incident started, in New South Wales, I think they're still trying to hand stuff over. They've changed departments, and it has been a little bit chaotic over there. But if you want to look at best practice, look at Victoria at the moment. Emergency Management Victoria and Emergency Recovery Victoria are doing a great job. So, and they've engaged with us, and they've acknowledged our ability to manage the recovery operations, manage spontaneous volunteers, which, spontaneous volunteering is a big thing during massive disasters, and it's getting bigger, right? Australians love to help other Australians. Migrants, like I'm a migrant, right? I'm of Irish heritage, like Irish, English, Turkish, Italian, they all like to help because we're proud of the country that we live in now. So spontaneous volunteers coming at time of emergency, particularly when you're organised to be able to receive them, brief them, train them, equipment, and then take them out and lead them successfully in the field is really assists in the recovery for the local community. And it also, we also get volunteers out of that because they go, this is not a bad organisation. We want to join up. And that's how we recruit our non-veterans and our non-first responders.
Thanks, Mark.
And I suppose just for me to respond from a government perspective, you're absolutely right. We do need to, and we are moving to obtain that level of understanding so that we can have well-designed policies and programs, but not just disability, but all other vulnerable community impacts, both on how we coordinate. And I can assure you the leadership of NEMA from Coordinator General Moon down is highly focused on all of that.
Thanks, Brad. And look, we're going to have to draw it to a close there. Sorry, didn't get to all those great questions. So yeah, look, fabulous. Thanks to the panel for their inputs. Yeah, and I think the vision really is for the national strategy is volunteering is at the heart of Australian communities, and we sort of see this in disasters. So it's important that, as we say, we want to get more people volunteering more often because of the challenges that we face. Certainly, if you want to know more about disaster resilience, my own organisation, ADA, the Knowledge Hub there has a wealth of information that will help people understand this complex beast of disaster resilience and what you can do to be involved. So come along and have a look at that. And thanks everyone. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you. Please give our panel a round of applause.